Wow, well, having Annette Insdorf introduce us is a special treat. What she didn't mention is that we actually went to college together and haven't seen each other, even though we're on the same campus, probably for 40 years. So that's pretty good. She's amazing. I'm really delighted to be here today with Paul, Jim, and Michael. As you heard from Annette, Cathedrals of Industry, Michael's beautiful collection of photographs, captures over 50 years of what we in political science call deindustrialization, the decline and transformation of America's manufacturing economy. And I'm sure that many of you here today remember when we actually had a manufacturing economy in New York. These pictures provide a context for tonight's discussion, which won't only be about the beautiful pictures in the book, but about other aspects of the economy. Many of the extraordinary structures captured by Michael are in ruins or have been razed for the development of housing or being used for other kinds of economic activity. Something I believe we need to understand is how this remaining infrastructure and manufacturing buildings in particular fit into America's economic future. This is a serious question, and all of you probably know that President Biden had an economic plan which was to bring manufacturing back to the United States with a signature program called CHIPS and Science and another program that was involved in the Inflation Reduction Act. So keep looking at the beautiful pictures as they pass behind us, but I am going to begin our conversation today with the first question for Paul. Now I'm going to ask you a really simple question, Paul. And you have, I hope enough time to answer that question. I would like you to provide us with some context for Michael's photos, okay? How did America's industrial economy decline? Because it certainly has. Those jobs have been gone for a long time, and those buildings, many of which were abandoned or razed, now are finally being considered worth reusing. And what really caused that decline in the United States?
Okay. So how many hours do we have?
That's right.
Look, I did a few number checks before this. So if you go back to 1970, about a quarter of American workers were in manufacturing. And if that were still true, we would have 40 million manufacturing workers today. We actually have 13 million at this point. Mostly that's not because we stopped producing manufactured goods. We actually still produce quite a lot. We import a lot, but it's still, even if all of those imports vanished, we would still be nowhere close to that kind of manufacturing economy. Most of it is, so actually, let me, there's two ways to look at this stuff. There's an economist's way of looking at it, which is obviously what I'm going to do, and then there's a kind of a social observer's way of looking at it. And each perspective is missing. The economist's view tends to be too cold and to miss the question of dignity, of place, of community. The social observers tends to miss do we actually need all those manufacturing jobs? Most of the jobs are gone because of technological change. We don't need as many people doing that kind of work as we used to. I believe Michael's first photograph there was the oldest, is of piers that have been torn down. So why are there no longer freight piers on the Hudson River? And the answer is not that we actually process less freight. It's because we don't do it the way we used to. There used to be back when Marlon Brando could have been a contender. There were 55,000 longshoremen in the New York area. There are now 4,000. And that's not because we've processed less freight. There's more stuff coming in than ever before, but it's all those, actually the best view I know is from the monorail at Newark Airport. Those massive, massive cranes lifting containers directly onto truck beds. And that's mostly where the manufacturing jobs went. Imports, trade contributed. And if you're an economist, you say, okay, you know, the China shock, we think the surge of Chinese imports between 2000 and 2010 seems to have displaced about 1.5 million manufacturing jobs. And if you're an economist, you say, oh, well, 1.5 million. I mean, 1.5 million American workers are fired every month. So that's,
that's a crazy
that's not
number.
a big thing. But on the other hand, what we learned, and this is actually, is that rips the heart out of communities. These are not an evenly distributed loss. So I think the question is, the main reason we're not a manufacturing economy is that we can satisfy the demand for manufactured goods with a lot fewer workers. It's the same reason that we used to be a country where most people were farmers.
But what about the free trade agreement? I mean, I'm a New Yorker who grew up in Queens, so I have this vision, right, of bread being manufactured by Tasty. There was the Domino refinery and the Swing Line Staple Factory, some of you may remember, in Long Island City. And what about in the Bronx, which manufactured Farberware? Right? Didn't we all have Farberware because it came from the Bronx?
Actually,
those jobs didn't, disappear. They just disappeared from New York.
Well, to a certain extent, they disappeared because they're just done with many fewer people. I mean, automation,
okay.
robots, and also actually New York deindustrialized a lot before much of the rest of the country, with the jobs at first not moving overseas but moving to South Carolina.
Right.
And it's also true that New York these days, it's a monoculture economy. Everything here basically feeds off Wall Street, and that drives up costs. And there's nothing necessarily, well, there is something wrong with Wall Street, but anyway, and it creates lots of other jobs. So most of us in this city work in things that ultimately are supported by the money made on Wall Street, but people are doctors and shopkeepers and all of that. But the question always here is, change happens. We couldn't freeze the economy as it was in 1890 when 60% of the workforce was farmers. We couldn't freeze the economy the way it was in 1970 when a quarter were manufacturing workers. But do we have to lose as much of the heritage? Do we have to lose as much of the community and as much of the physical structures as we do? And there's been a lot of atrocities there. And that's the way to think about it. There was no way we were going to stay a mainly industrial economy. We are a post-industrial economy. That was fated. That's change happens. The question is, are we managing the change in a way that preserves at least some of what was good about the past?
Yeah, so I want to follow up on this, and then before we get to Michael, because I think this is really important, especially in the New York metropolitan area and the pictures that are captured in this book. There is this new industrial economy that's emerging in the United States. Some of it's here in New York. I mean, I've been to the Brooklyn Navy Yard and to some of those places where there's a form of manufacturing happening there. But I don't know if that's, boutique. Does that have anything to do with the broader trends of what we need in our economy? And what does this new industrial economy really look like? Are we going to reuse these old spaces in a functional way?
This is problematic. I mean, sometimes some old industrial spaces can be repurposed really well. It turns out that actually older ones, but 19th century mills can often be turned into great residential spaces. Because they have really high ceilings and really huge windows. And the reason they have those is because before electrification, you had a big steam engine in the basement that was running cranks and pulleys, and you had a bar overhead. And you had to have high ceilings to transmit the power, and you had to have big windows because there were no electric lights. And that fortuitously turns out to make great condos now. But there are other things too, and there are ways you can save it. On the other hand, a modern factory looks very different from an old factory. It's a lot more machines. A lot of old factories were kind of vertical because that's what the technology demanded, and modern factories are sprawling with wide aisles, and New York City is not the greatest place to have that kind of factory. So some of it can be saved or it can be repurposed, and that's what you try to do where you can. And you try to avoid crimes like the destruction of Penn Station.
Yeah, we've done a lot of that, unfortunately, in this city. And I think, that really leads us to you, Michael. And I mean, what people don't know is you've really been documenting this industrial decline and transformation for over 50 years, which is why the book is so rich and the pictures are so varied. And I just have to say, I was so excited to see the Streit's matzah factory there, because as a kid, we went to the Lower East Side, and the trip was to the Streit's matzah factory and other
samples.
Aspects.
You get to sample the matzah
Yeah, you
as it
did
came
get
out of
a
the ovens.
sample when you went, but you weren't supposed to eat it before Passover. That was the problem. But it was hard for kids in elementary school to understand that. But your pictures are extraordinary. But I would love you to tell us more about what you think we lost and what's no longer there, and what kind of opportunities were created by this destruction, because I think you have some interesting things to say about that too.
Well, first of all, I want to tell you that thank you very much, Dr. Krugman, for being on this panel. But this started out as a 52-year journey. I started out photographing the New York City piers as they were being torn down or burnt down. A number of the pictures in the book, you'd see a picture of it, and I would come back to shoot it again, and it had burned down during the week. All of this, but my influence in this, two influencers, was Walker Evans, the photographer of the 20s and 30s and 40s, and a man named Danny Lyons, who did a book called Destruction of Lower Manhattan, which was about when they tore all the buildings down and all the businesses down where the World Trade Center went up.
Yeah.
So that was the Washington markets. There was something called Radio Row. I think it was on Chambers Street, and there was another street with just pet shops. And they all disappeared when they built this building, when they built that building. So that's how it all started. So Dr. Krugman said, that the seaport changed very radically and very quickly because container service changed everything in shipping. When the New York seaport was in, you had rope and pulley pulling stuff out of the hold of the ship by pallets. And then this man, I don't remember his name, invented the shipping container. And now everything was containerized, literally, and there was no room to put a container service in Manhattan. So that all moved down to Brooklyn and in Newark. And then there was steamship. There were a lot of steamship terminals on the west side. And they're gone because nobody really does anything with steamships anymore. So the answer to the question is, what can you do with it? When they tore all the lower Manhattan ones down, they built Battery Park City.
Yep.
And you'll see in the book there's a sign that this land is going to be turned into Battery Park City under the auspices of Mayor Lindsay.
Right, and the state.
Right. Another idea with...
That was you, Carrie.
We're going to go to Buffalo now, and there's something called in Buffalo the First Ward. And the First Ward were grain elevators. The grain elevator, as you all know, are those big silo-looking things that stand. They look like giants. It was invented by a man named Dart in Buffalo. And Buffalo was the main terminal of the grain that came from the Midwest into the New York area, and then it was transferred by either the Erie Canal or by railroads to the Hudson River, and then down the Hudson River into the New York piers, and that's where all of the grain was dispersed, in the New York piers. But that all disappeared when the St. Lawrence Seaway came in. So they didn't have to stop in Buffalo anymore. It went straight through to the Hudson River and down. So Buffalo went into decline. The repurposing has been very tough for the grain elevators.
Yeah.
My friend who owns a business called Rigidized Metals, who actually family built the design, manufactured the continents for the Unisphere.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
The World's Fair in Queens.
The World's Fair in
Don't
Queens.
remember.
And the
I
Unisphere.
remember.
I do too.
So he bought a number of grain elevators right near his plant, which were called, the main one was called Lake and Rail, and he was going to turn that into a ethanol plant.
Wow.
But then ethanol died a horrible death,
Yes.
essentially. So that got killed. But there was one other one that he owned, which was called the PV elevator, and that's the first one, I believe, that's being converted into housing. How, I don't know.
Amazing.
Because they
Sound plausible.
Because a grain elevator was made up of empty tubes, and they're about 120 feet tall, and they are usually filled with grain. And as my wife knows, that when you're at the top of one, they have these holes in the floor. And I said to her, she was wandering around looking at her phone, she was my assistant, and I said, Roz, see those holes in the floor? They're 120 feet down. Don't fall.
Yeah. Right. Can you tell us a little about the Lackawanna steel mills? Because
The Lackawanna Steel Mill, that's
Yes.
Bethlehem Steel.
that's right.
Right.
I think a lot of people just associated Bethlehem Steel with Pennsylvania. But this
The
is
original
New
part
York.
of it was Bethlehem, Pennsylvania.
That's right.
Then they opened the one on Lake Erie in the town of Lackawanna, which is just south of Buffalo. I believe at the height when they, well, first of all, Bethlehem Steel was one of the two backbones of the United States in terms of building, U.S. Steel and Bethlehem Steel. To give you an idea, all of the Iowa-class destroyers were built with Bethlehem Steel. The George Washington Bridge, Bethlehem Steel. So almost everything up until the late 80s was Bethlehem Steel or U.S. Steel. So Bethlehem, I think, when did they go out of business? 94, 95, do you think? Yeah.
Yes.
They had a real problem with arrogant management. They were very top-heavy with salary and the management, and they didn't want to change, and that's basically what killed the Bethlehem Steel. Repurposing of Bethlehem and PA is a casino. They took the blast furnaces in that area, and they turned it into a casino. In the Bethlehem Lackawanna, it's now a wind farm. I think one of the problems with the Bethlehem Lackawanna is it's a Superfund site.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, that's a little tough to repurpose
So
that.
it's a lot of acreage and it's a Superfund site. The odor from that place was astounding.
Which is, by the way, we don't want to romanticize the industrial era too much.
Yeah, I know. But it's, if anybody remembers when Clinton passed, told us how well we were going to do with the free trade agreements, and I remember that we were told we were going to have all the clean jobs here and all the dirty jobs were going to move away, and somehow that, he didn't figure out that chips could be manufactured in China just as well as here, and we somehow didn't retain all of those
clean jobs.
industrial jobs that were clean here either.
Chips is a lot less clean than people think, by the way.
Oh, that's interesting.
The demands for water are pretty, anyway, but actually, I don't want to.
Go ahead,
Go ahead.
and then we're going to go to Jim.
Because I was actually interested, you have the two Bethlehem plants, the Lackawanna, but also Bethlehem itself.
Mm-hmm.
And the Bethlehem Steel, of course, is gone from Bethlehem, but that's an interesting question where the question is, we're not just interested in plants, we're interested in communities.
Right.
And the odd thing is that the Lehigh Valley is, by some measures, it's a success story. Because although the steel industry is gone, It's actually, employment is now at higher than ever, but it's not industry, it's distribution centers. A lot of it's Amazon, but others as well. It turns out to be a good location. And so they have a large workforce, which is basically the stuff that, how you get your 2-day delivery from Amazon, is a lot of that's coming from the Allentown, that area in Lehigh Valley, which at one level, that's a happy story because there's a lot of places where industry disappeared and nothing took its place.
Right.
So, but on the other hand, is it the same thing? Is it the same kind of community? Do the jobs bring the same kind of dignity? And what could we do to, how do we not just rescue regions, but also, which is itself very hard, but rescue regions in a way that retains some of the character that they used to have?
Well,
Yeah, this is
distribution
the
centers
most
don't pay very
difficult
well at
thing
all.
that
No.
you mentioned here, because the transition of communities, the transformation of communities is sort of the bread and butter of cities. I mean, they don't, as much as people would like to think, oh, these neighborhoods remain the same, but they don't, and the communities don't remain the same, and we're all kind of stuck in a paradigm now, thinking that communities can only mean one thing. New immigrants come into these places and transform communities and use spaces that others thought were unusable. And I think, this is an important part of the conversation, and I want to bring in Jim, because Jim was the one who sort of put the words to the pictures in this book, and he has an important story to tell in terms of thinking about, I think, Paul, what you just articulated around the community issue, and Michael, what you just said around how you figure out how to use these structures in different ways, because not everything can be done in the same way. So can you just tell us about the adaptive reuse stories that you have come into contact with, and how communities have transformed these old industrial spaces?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can actually get into the communities, but I did my homework beforehand.
Good.
And
I did give everybody questions, but you can imagine that they have other things to say.
right. So I did some research, and I asked, what are the 10 most common reuses of industrial sites like this? And I came up with a list. So let me just run through it really quickly. Urban regeneration and housing, which we touched on, including condos and wonderful examples there. Cultural and creative spaces, commercial and office spaces, retail and entertainment, parks and recreation, tech and innovation hubs, education centers, tourism, heritage sites, environment and green development, and film, believe it or not, number 10, film and photo studios. Not once do you hear the word manufacturing on that list, which I think is really, really interesting. Now, the story I think that you're kind of alluding to, in my real life, I'm actually a corporate speechwriter. I worked for a company that globally does a lot of automation work, both on the IT and the OT side. So
And I always thought teaching was real life.
no,
I missed the boat on that.
speechwriting pays the real bills. So anyway, so I was writing a speech for one of our executives on our capabilities, and I came across the phrase "dark factory," and I thought, well, as a speechwriter, I love interesting words. So I asked, what does dark factory mean? I think I know, but I wanted to test the hypothesis, and they said, well, it's dark because there are no lights, and there are no lights because there are no people. And I thought to myself, oh, that's interesting. Now, that may be a selling point for the company we're selling our capabilities to, but that is not a selling point to the community, right? And
Right.
my understanding is that a lot of political figures want to attract this kind of investment in their communities, but they want to be able to talk about three things: jobs, jobs, jobs. And to Paul's point, if so much of this automation is going to be reduced in the number of jobs, what impact socially, economically, et cetera, does that have? And my undergrad was in economics, so I'm going to try and see if I can go against the Nobel Laureate
yes,
here. But
take on
but
the
I mean, to the
Nobel
point,
Laureate.
right? Well, good luck with that, right?
The all-purpose response to anything that
Yeah.
is It's more complicated than
Is that right? Exactly, exactly. But I mean, one of the concepts I remember from Econ 101 was the multiplier effect, right? So say you have 100 people in a small factory, the multiplier effect of all these people paying their taxes, paying their property taxes, paying their income taxes, going out to lunch at the local diner, et cetera. That employs other people and so on and so on. It becomes a virtuous cycle. But what happens when instead of 100 people, you have 5 running it?
Right.
You don't have a real multiplier effect there, right? I think that's really dangerous. And one of the things I thought of before coming here, I remember, well, the older I get, the more I come to the conclusion that Rod Serling knew the future well before any of us in the Twilight Zone. And there was an episode, I looked it up, there was an episode from May 1964 called The Brain Center at Whipple's.
Wow.
Where, yeah, these computers, what were computers back then, take over the jobs. But the irony at the end of the show was that the boss is then replaced by a robot. It was really, look it up, folks. It's on YouTube, The Brain Center at Whipple's. I thought, my Lord, this is 60 years ago. They were already predicting this. And yeah.
Kurt Vonnegut, player piano.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, 1951, where automation takes all the jobs, including the guy who designs the machines eventually. Except that the funny thing is that didn't happen. We're not a jobless country.
Right.
People in their prime working years, the employment rate is higher than it ever was right now. But they're different jobs. What we did is we automated away a lot of industrial jobs. We automated away, the prediction that the machines are going to take there's always so far been other jobs to come along. But for communities, it makes it's actually, in regional science, the base multiplier model. You have an industrial base or something that sells stuff to other places, but then the people employed there spend their money locally and so on, and it produces, and that's what every town, every city is. There's a base, which is the stuff it sells to other parts of the world, and then there's all the service jobs that around that.
Right.
And the problem with New York now is that our base is all finance.
It's all finance and service. It's service.
Well, all the
jobs,
services basically.
And it's tech, right? Also.
A little bit of tech.
A little bit of tech.
And
Thank
hospitals.
Michael Bloomberg, right?
No, the hospitals is derivative. Every place has hospitals. That's the.
It's not unique.
I can get into these things a lot.
But one of the added problems in the older cities, particularly of the Northeast and the Midwest, which I think this book captures that, is that there are all of these old buildings and structures and spaces that can't all be knocked down, that we need to figure out how to reuse them in a way that creates a viable city, a viable community for the people so that they can produce the multiplier.
Unless it's a
effect.
Superfund site, but yeah.
Yeah, if it's not a Superfund site, then you don't have that. So really, Paul,
funny you throw
I
that.
need to ask you one more question before we go to the Q&A from the audience, which is, I know something that, a lot of people here, including myself, have been thinking about. I'm going to say it gingerly, which is, will President-elect Trump continue any of President Biden's policies that support the new industrialization? So I'm narrowing it. I'm trying to be true to our panel here and not ask you those big questions that are not part of our discussion, which I really want to ask you.
Well, no,
but I'm not.
I'm not going to do that.
I'm not. I said I wouldn't.
Actually, that's one of those things where I am not sure. There's a lot of things which a lot of all the stuff we're not going to talk about, all people saying that it's not going to be as bad as you worry. I think it will be as bad as you worry. But the industrial policies were very cleverly designed. They were designed to create facts on the ground. Yeah. So once you've got that battery factory in Kentucky, then it's actually quite hard even for a a new administration that absolutely hates the battery factor. May have been there because we were trying to save the climate, and they may have no sympathy at all for that goal. But are they prepared to take away the new factory that this town has finally gotten? So I think a lot of it may survive, and a lot of stuff is already in place already, and maybe harder to reverse. Lots of other things, it's I think it's hard. You all know what my politics are, but these are glory days for measles. But and
You
stuff
do
like
write a column in the
Right.
New York Times, I think.
But I actually
don't
think that
know.
quite a lot of the industrial, quite a lot of the industrial development may well survive because it does. I mean, politicians do not want to see a factory that opened 2 years ago in their town go away, and so it may hold together.
Jobs equals votes, by the way.
Yeah.
So.
Well, yeah. I mean, and that was very deliberate. I mean, I talked to a fair number of my students were in this administration, and this was very much self-conscious that we're doing these reindustrialization projects are designed to have some political durability.
Smart.
I think, ironically, what might happen is that the next president will have the benefits in his economy of this investment that was done during the Biden administration.
Yeah.
Is that possible?
Well, some of it, but it's but there's plenty of other ways to screw up. So.
Yeah. Okay, I won't say we're counting on it, but yeah. All right, I'm going to ask some questions from the audience here. So everybody can jump in. I'll try and direct the questions. It seems pretty obvious who gets which questions. First, has the U.S. ever had a long-term industrial policy? I think you have to answer that, Paul.
Yeah, not really, although we've certainly never conceptualized it that way until recently. Now we do, or we did, or we do for the next 2 months, whatever. But if you look at, those first, a lot of what we think of as the sort of traditional industrial structure, particularly the regional stuff, is the product of Cold War defense spending. And so we basically did have a project of building up industry to support a military that relative to the economy was 3 times as big as it is now. And so in that sense we had one, but other than that, mostly not. We do and we do a lot of stuff that's implicit. I can go on a bit, but you mentioned hospitals. That's if you actually what does provide some decent jobs in left behind regions.
Yeah.
Hospitals are a big part of it.
And universities also.
Universities is much smaller, but hospitals and who pays for the hospitals? Well, Washington, of course, it's Medicare basically, which there's a whole other stuff. But if you ask, where in West Virginia are there decent jobs now? Coal mining is gone, but healthcare is actually quite big business. All of it's supported by federal funds, and the trouble, it's great. I mean, these are real jobs and obviously important jobs. One of the issues that does arise, and I think I kept on thinking about looking at your photographs, is that a lot of the good jobs in the places that used to have industry are female coded.
Huh.
Nurses, it really is, and that is part of the problem.
Well, the largest employer on Long Island is Northwell Hospital, Northwell Health System.
That's true. Yeah.
West Virginia has 10 times as many people in health and human services as it does in mining.
Yeah, I'm sure.
They think that they're a coal mining state, but they haven't been for generations.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
They have a lot of sick
I won't
people
touch
because of
the
it.
political implications of what you just said, of what people don't understand and what they don't know.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting question, which I think, Michael, you might want to start us off on. There is an observation here that historically slavery played a role in industrialization. And have any of the photographs that you shot, when were they built? Is there any legacy of slavery in that, or the Northeast really
The Northeast was
didn't?
sort of immune to that. I don't think we had slavery in, well, I think the oldest place that I photographed was 1906, 1910.
Yeah.
So the slavery did not play any part of that.
Yeah, so maybe the question then is, was there any kind of racial preference or racism in the creation of the industrial economy in the United States that you may have unearthed in some of your photographs, and then maybe Jim?
Not in the, I basically only worked in the Northeast. If you move that over to Chicago and Detroit, then you have that.
Interesting.
Because you had that mass
Right, from the south.
The migration.
exodus from Mississippi, you know, straight up to
Yeah.
Chicago and Detroit and the auto industry and everything, and the meat packing and slaughterhouses. That was where that comes into effect.
That's interesting. So, Jim, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I don't, again, the slavery issue I'm not sure about, but I mean, to me, a lot of the jobs you see there were entry points, particularly for recent immigrants. This was their path to the middle class,
That's right.
right? And I think much of this is...
Hungarian.
Yeah, exactly. I think in a lot of the cases in the places where you photographed, Michael, were in the Northeast were probably more, like you said, Eastern European immigrants, et cetera. You know, the entry points, I think, for immigrants are very, very different today. But I don't think, you know, Paul, correct me if I got this right or wrong, you know, the wages are extremely different. They're not necessarily union jobs. They don't have the same protections as they did before. And they certainly don't have the sort of manual labor. You mentioned dignity. I wondered whether you were sort of hearkening back to Sherrod Brown's line that he used a lot, you know, the dignity of work, right?
Well, I wasn't, but it's, yeah.
But yeah, we know the line. But there are just fewer opportunities for people trying to get into the middle class with these types of jobs, and it seems like most of them are in the service economy, and they're not as well paid. So it's a very different set of circumstances.
I just want to say that manufacturing jobs are not inherently good jobs with high pay. In the 19th century, they weren't. The reason that we think of the 50s and the 60s as a time when manufacturing jobs were good jobs was because they were union jobs.
Yeah.
And there's no inherent reason why Amazon distribution centers couldn't be unionized.
Right. Well, they're busy unionizing graduate students at Columbia, so they can't go and unionize where it's difficult and where they, you know, Amazon.
I'm unionized at
or
NYU.
Starbucks.
I'm a member of the UAW. Imagine.
Yeah, the UAW. Why aren't they unionizing Amazon and Starbucks? Well, at least
They
Amazon.
closed the business or they hired
No, it's,
everybody.
union movement really took a huge hit, basically, in the 80s.
Right.
because of the change
Started
in
with
political
Patco
climate.
and the strike.
No, it's such an important point that these weren't inherently jobs with dignity or that provided decent wages. And in fact, part of the reason jobs moved out of New York is because they were unionized and had decent wages, and they moved down to states which had no unions.
Right.
So a lot of the auto workers, which were, I mean, you can go up to the Columbia campus and see the Studebaker factory.
Yeah.
That was once, that is mentioned in your book, actually, by Joe Stiglitz, that he looks out over the Studebaker factory from his office, and now it's office space. But those eventually became unionized jobs. And they move, all of it moves out to places where mostly you didn't have a union and where wages could be dropped.
And you're assuming that it's only in the United States. It went all over the world.
That's right.
As supply chains became more global, you kept sort of a
That's right.
By the way, if we talk about New York as having once been, I think the biggest employer when New York was a big industrial city was the garment industry.
Right.
And anybody who has a romantic notion of what life was like in the garment industry, my God.
Work in the Triangle Shirt Factory.
Triangle
Yeah.
Shirt Factory, exactly.
which now, by the way, is an NYU building, ironically. Yeah. So
Well,
is it been repurposed exactly as I said?
Interesting about the adaptive reuse in the Brooklyn Navy Yard and in these different spaces is boutique aspects of the garment industry have remained in New York. So there is manufacturing, as you pointed out, but it's at a much smaller scale. So it's the samples, for example, as opposed to the mass manufacturing.
Schmalberg.
Yeah, would you speak a little bit about that example?
I can't talk yet.
Okay, we'll wait. Okay, then I'm going to ask the next question to Paul, because it's about tariffs. And the question is, how much will tariffs promote U.S. industrialization, which is what President-elect Trump claims? So this is a legitimate question. And in what sectors could it possibly do it, if it could?
Okay, the pretty much consensus among everybody who has studied these things is that the tariffs will do very, very little to promote manufacturing. The original Trump tariffs from term one appear by most analyses to have actually cost manufacturing jobs on net. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that manufacturing is embedded in these global supply chains. So you put on a bunch of tariffs, you actually end up raising the costs of U.S. factories, because so much of what they use, especially, auto industry. There is no U.S. auto industry. There's a North American auto industry with this extremely dense interconnected web of factories in Mexico, the United States, and Canada. If we put tariffs on the Mexican border, which Trump says he's going to do, you're going to be enormously raising the costs of producing cars in America. So, and then the other thing, which gets you into esoteric but unfortunately really important economics, is either the tariffs cause the dollar to strengthen, which makes U.S. industry less competitive, or it's met by retaliation from the rest of the world, which kills manufacturing exports. So it's very unlikely that it's going to make any significant difference to the number of manufacturing jobs.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what actually happens, but apparently most economists agree with you, as you know, about what we're going to get from this if he actually passes it, if he actually does it in some significant way. I mean, so let's go back to you, Michael. I wanted you to weigh in on this issue of, industrial jobs as good jobs, and whether or not the kinds of spaces you photographed and that you kind of know deeply about were the kinds of spaces where, people were able to thrive and provide decent wages for their workers.
If you take a look at the Klotz chapter in the book, was a silk spinning mill. It was a mill that was started somewhere around just before World War I, and it was closed in 1957. It was on the border of, the building is still there. It's in Lonaconing, Maryland, which is about 11 miles
West Virginia.
East of West Virginia. And the rationale for this factory was mostly staffed by women. It was the wives of the coal miners. They could hire them at, I think, $1.35. There's a picture in the book of the wages, but the minimum wage was something like $1.35, which I don't know what that really translates to. But it was a very low-paying job. The reason that factory closed is because the workers decided in June of 1957 that they wanted a raise. And Mr. Klotz said, turned the key, that was a Friday night, he turned the key, and they never reopened again.
Yeah.
And it's like a museum in this building because, well, I was going to tell the quick story. The man who owned the building when I was there was a man named Mr. Crawford. And Mr. Crawford decided to go into business with a man who was in the government in Lonaconing, Maryland. And all of a sudden, he went into partnership with the guy to buy the business and repurpose the building and repurpose
Right.
the mills. However, the guy who was in the government wound up in jail. And he was left holding the bag, and he owned this thing for 20 years before I came there. And he let a few people in, and at the time you had to beg and plead to be able to go in there and photograph it. He was not the most pleasant man I've ever dealt with. And he wound up throwing me out after 4 hours, even though he told me I could work 2 days there. But, you know, the pictures are really interesting. But no, the wages were terrible. Wages in most factories were not very good, unless you're talking about what Paul just said. During the 50s, you know, after World War II, we needed a lot of workers, and, you know, there was a union in the 50s and 60s. People tell me that in my industry, when you lived in Rochester, you could graduate high school, walk across the street, and get a job at Kodak.
Kodak. Oh, my God.
Kodak was the biggest.
That's right.
It was
They made
huge.
it.
But you could literally just graduate high school and get a good-paying job at Kodak. It's gone.
Yeah, and that had more to do with management, by the way, because they actually had digital, but they did not bet on digital.
I've been in the photo industry for 50-some-odd years.
Yes.
And I can tell you that Polaroid did the same thing. They were the people at Polaroid, the people at Kodak were so arrogant. They know better. So I'll give you a very quick, story. I had I think it was not Reuters, it was AFP, Agence France Presse. Was a customer of mine, and they bought a complete emulsion number of E6 film. An emulsion number is a production run. They wanted that particular production run, and I had to buy it from Kodak, and they were supposed to buy it for me. That was a contract we had. Well, it turned out the film was defective. So I called up Kodak and I said, we have a problem. Too bad.
Too bad.
Too bad. I wound up solving the whole problem is going to Fuji. And I had that same problem with Fuji eventually because I was moving a lot of film. And one of my customers had a bad batch of off-color Fuji film.